Welcome to the debate. Imagine you are tasked with building a state-of-the-art robotic arm for a high-precision manufacturing plant.
Okay.
And in the laboratory, you hand this robot a perfectly machined piece of metal, and it welds it flawlessly every single time. I mean, it looks like an absolute miracle of modern engineering.
Right, the perfect demo.
Exactly. But then you move that exact same robot out of the pristine lab and onto the actual factory floor. And the conveyor belt is just dumping mixed, bent, unassorted parts at 100 miles an hour.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
There's grease on the lenses, the timing is completely off, and, well, the robot instantly fails. But it breaks down not because the mechanical arm is flawed or, because the code running it isn't brilliant. It fails because the environment it was placed in is entirely chaotic.
Yeah, and if you are listening to this and you work in enterprise IT or finance, you probably have a pit in your stomach right now because that is the perfect visual for the staggering statistical reality we are seeing in enterprise AI today.
It really is.
The numbers are incredibly consistent across the board. Right now, roughly 60% of large organizations are actively evaluating these tools. About 20% manage to push through to a meaningful pilot stage, which is a lot.
Let's make the robot in the lab.
Exactly, the robot in the lab. It looks fantastic on a slide deck in a boardroom.
But then we hit the cliff, because only 5% of these organizations successfully deploy that intelligence into production with a sustained, measurable financial impact. I mean, that is a 95% drop-off from pilot to production.
It's wild.
In literally any other domain of enterprise capital investment, like if you were building a physical factory or launching a new product line, a failure rate of that magnitude would trigger a fundamental ground-up reassessment of your entire strategy.
Right. And yet, what we see instead is organizations just, running more pilots. They hire different vendors. They tweak the hyperparameters of the model. They buy more compute. They just blindly hope for a different outcome on the factory floor.
Which brings us to the core tension we are exploring today, because we know definitively what isn't causing this 95% failure rate. It is not a model limitation. I mean, the underlying models have never been more capable.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is not a talent gap, and it certainly is not a budget issue. The source material presents a fundamental disagreement regarding the true root cause of this systemic failure. I will be arguing that this failure is purely architectural, stemming from the fact that models are being forced to operate on uncurated, decoupled data that has completely lost its native business context.
And I will argue that while data architecture is obviously undeniably critical, the true bottleneck separating that elite 5% from everyone else is the presence of an inherent governance framework. Specifically, the structural transition from human review to cryptographically verifiable automated action.
Okay, let's lay out the foundation of this architectural mismatch first. To understand why 95% of these deployments just crash and burn, we have to look at what we call the overlay model.
For the last 20 years, enterprises have been told that the way to achieve intelligence is to extract data from their source systems, like their ERPs, their enterprise resource planning software, and aggregate it into a massive central repository. We call them data lakes, data warehouses, or, unified analytical platforms.
The classic single source of truth pitch.
Exactly. And the logic seems totally sound on the surface, right? Put everything in one place so you can analyze it. But this fundamentally misunderstands how business systems actually work. When you extract business data from an ERP, it undergoes what is known as semantic decay. It just loses its embedded meaning.
Well, I think we need to visualize what semantic decay actually means in practice because it sounds a bit like academic jargon.
Fair point, yeah. Think of extracting data from an ERP into a data lake like taking apart a Swiss watch and throwing all the individual gears into a bucket.
Okay.
You still technically have all the data, right? Every gear, every spring, every screw is in that bucket. But you've completely lost the physical relationships that actually make it tell time.
Right.
An ERP doesn't just store flat numbers. It stores relationships, the sequence of transactions, strict currency logic, complex organizational hierarchies. A pilot only works because a human being essentially acted as a watchmaker, manually piecing those gears back together to create a sanitized dataset for the model to play with.
Yeah, they curated the sandbox.
Exactly. But production fails because the full, messy reality of uncurated data cannot be processed at transaction speed.
without what we call a canonical data layer, which is a standardized, continuous representation of truth sitting close to the source. The semantic decay just destroys the model's reliability.
Look, I completely acknowledge the data problem. Semantic decay is a massive hurdle. But I come at it from a different way. My perspective is that you could have perfectly standardized, mathematically pristine canonical data. You could have your Swiss watch fully assembled and ticking perfectly. And if you lack proper action governance, you will still end up with a failed production deployment.
Really?
Yeah. The real issue here is the structural limitation of chain of thought architectures.
Break that down for me.
Right now, most enterprise AI systems are designed to think. They analyze, they summarize, they look for anomalies, and then, crucially, they recommend an action for a human being to review. When you design a system that way, you immediately hit a throughput ceiling.
A ceiling bounded by human capacity.
Exactly. It's a fundamental law of operations. Every human review creates a queue, and a queue has a maximum service rate. It does not matter if your AI generates 10,000 brilliant, perfectly accurate recommendations a minute based on flawless canonical data.
Because the humans can't keep up.
Right. If your finance team can only physically review and approve 50 of those recommendations a day, your operational throughput hasn't changed. You haven't transformed the business. You've just built a very expensive machine that makes your employees feel hopelessly behind schedule.
Yeah, I can see that.
The 5% succeed because they build chain of action architectures. These are systems with strict governance parameters, defined escalation paths, and cryptographic audit trails designed in from the very beginning. They don't just think, they act autonomously. And that automated action is what actually changes the economic profile of a department.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on why the data foundation has to precede any conversation about automated action.
Sure.
We need to delve deeply into the concept that metadata is not meaning. Let's look at a very specific example from the material. Take a revenue figure sitting in an enterprise resource planning system. To a human, it looks like a number. Let's say $10,000.
Okay.
But that figure is not simply a numeric value. It is the end product of a validated chain of transactions. It is recognized over 3 months, tied to a specific subsidiary in Germany, billed in euros, but reported in dollars, and validated against strict temporal rules regarding which version of the record is currently active.
Right. And when it moves to a data lake, you strip away the temporal logic.
You lose almost all the logic. It becomes just 10,000 with a few metadata tags attached to it. So imagine you deploy an AI agent to manage intercompany reconciliations. Without a canonical layer, standardizing those relationships and preserving that embedded meaning, the agent cannot possibly tell if a specific invoice is a genuine net new revenue event or merely a duplicate intercompany transaction that needs to be eliminated from a ledger.
Well,
But I have to stop you there, because no amount of downstream governance, no matter how elegant your escalation paths are, matters if the agent is making decisions based on degraded, ambiguous data. If the input is semantically hollow, the cryptographically verified output is just a highly accountable, perfectly documented mistake.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are operating under the assumption that standardizing the data automatically unlocks value. It doesn't.
How so?
Let's play out your scenario. Let's say you build this perfect canonical layer. Every field definition is standardized across the globe, local idiosyncrasies are stripped away, and the business context of that $10,000 transaction is beautifully preserved.
Sounds great.
It does. You hook up your AI, and because the data is perfect, it flawlessly identifies every single anomaly, every intercompany mismatch, and flags them for the finance department with 100% accuracy. What have you actually achieved?
You've achieved absolute visibility. You've eliminated the blind spots that cause massive write-downs at the end of the quarter.
But you haven't changed the fundamental economics of the finance department. You've just built a faster machine for generating tasks for humans. Every single flag still creates a queue. The structural shift, the actual return on investment that defines the successful 5%, only happens when the AI is legally and systemically allowed to execute the correcting entry in the ledger itself.
Right, I follow that.
And allowing a machine to execute a financial entry in a publicly traded enterprise system is entirely a governance challenge not a data structure challenge. The CFO doesn't pull the plug on an AI project because the data is bad. The CFO stops the project because they cannot prove to an external auditor why a machine independently decided to write down $1 million asset.
Wait, before we move on to the auditor aspect, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Are you essentially saying that even if we solve the semantic decay, the human bottleneck makes it the intelligence worthless?
Yes.
Because I would argue they can't prove why the machine took the action precisely because the architecture allows the machine to look at the wrong data in the first place. This is why the intelligence exclusivity rule is so crucial.
The exclusivity rule is an interesting concept, but how does it solve the governance problem?
Because it creates a firewall. The intelligence exclusivity rule is an architectural principle stating that absolutely no AI system should operate on data that hasn't passed through the canonical layer first. Think about the reality of legacy enterprise systems. You have customized ERPs full of Z programs, for example.
We should clarify what that means for people who haven't spent their lives in SAP implementations.
Oh, good point. If you've ever worked in SAP, you know about Z programs. For everyone else, these are highly customized, localized pieces of code. It's basically digital duct tape holding a specific regional process together.
Yeah, the stuff that keeps IT up at night.
Exactly. It's a workaround created because the standard software didn't fit a local business need. These workarounds are incredibly fragile, and they pollute the data stream with non-standard formatting. If you let an AI bypass the canonical layer and look at raw ERP data, it is going to encounter this heterogeneous mess of duct tape code.
Right.
The intelligence exclusivity rule acts like a bouncer at a club. It prevents the AI from ever trying to compensate for the data quality problems created by those customizations. It only sees mathematically verified data. I would argue this rule is the sole reason why the exact same algorithmic model works reliably in one enterprise and fails spectacularly in another. The AI model didn't change. The firewall protecting its inputs changed.
Look, I completely acknowledge the elegance of the intelligence exclusivity rule. It is a brilliant architectural principle. But we have to look at the CFO's core concern, because that is where these projects live or die on the factory floor.
Okay. The source material hits on a very specific premise. The CFO's question about chain of action intelligence is not, can it be trusted, but can it be governed? Trust is a data quality concept. Governance is an accountability concept.
You're separating the two, but aren't they deeply intertwined? I mean, if I don't trust the data, I can't govern the system. They are related, but they require fundamentally different engineering to solve. You can have trustworthy canonical data and an entirely ungovernable system. What prevents executive panic, what actually allows a pilot to transition into a production deployment, is the accountability infrastructure, specifically how the system handles the cryptographic audit trail.
Explain exactly how that works in practice, because I think audit trail gets thrown around as a buzzword a lot.
Right, it's not just a standard log file. A standard log file can be edited by a database admin. Cryptography makes it immutable.
Right.
When an AI agent resolves a standard mismatch without human intervention, say it automatically clears an invoice discrepancy, it must leave a cryptographically verifiable record. That means it uses mathematical encryption to link that automated action directly back to its data source and the exact decision logic it used, permanently stamping it with a time and date. It cannot be retroactively altered. So if the external auditors walk in at the end of the year and ask, why did the system write down this asset? The CFO doesn't just wave their hands and say, well, our data is really clean. No, they pull the cryptographic proof of the exact parameter the agent followed. It proves the machine acted within its legal bounds. That is the non-negotiable factor that gets you to the 5%.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. I don't disagree that the cryptographic audit trail is necessary. But the reason that audit trail even matters in the way you are describing is because of how the global regulatory landscape is shifting. And that shift forces our hand on the data architecture anyway.
How so?
Look at continuous transaction controls, or CTC, and the real-time government reporting mandates that are rolling out globally right now.
Ah, you're talking about the shift from retrospective auditing to real-time validation.
Exactly. Let's break down CTC. Imagine the government is essentially CC'd on every single invoice your company generates, the exact second it is generated.
Governments in Europe, Latin America, and increasingly Asia are no longer waiting for an end-of-year audit to see your books.
Right, they want it immediately.
They are validating invoices at the moment of the transaction to prevent tax fraud. And this is fundamentally ending the traditional retrospective audit cycle. You can't do a month-end sprint to reconcile messy data anymore because the government already has the transaction record.
The government platforms are quite literally becoming part of the daily workflow.
Yes. Organizations that understand this aren't treating CTC as just another compliance headache. They are treating it as a mandatory data infrastructure investment because you have to report in real time. You are forced to digitize every transaction perfectly at the source. This creates a continuously maintained financial position. And here is where it ties back to AI. That continuous stream of flawlessly structured data is the ultimate enabler for what the material calls the Internet of Agents. When the data flows continuously and cleanly, the governance almost becomes a byproduct of the architecture. You don't need heavy manual governance if the data itself is governed at the point of creation.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered what actually happens to the human workforce in that scenario?
What do you mean?
Well, I agree that the Internet of Agents is the mature form of enterprise intelligence. We are talking about a distributed ecosystem of highly specialized AI agents working together. One agent is handling VAT management, another is doing cash flow forecasting, another is executing R2R automation.
The whole life cycle of financial data into a compliance statement?
Exactly. Record to report, taking raw ledger entries and turning them into the official financial statements. Having a specialized agent do that is brilliant. Specialization enables depth of intelligence, and distribution across an internet of agents enables massive scale. But the human organization does not disappear in this model. The humans don't just pack up and go home because the agents are talking to each other.
No, of course not. The nature of their work shifts.
It shifts drastically, and I will argue this is the true barrier to entry for the 95% who fail. They cannot execute the human shift. We are talking about fundamentally redefining what finance professionals do.
Right.
You have to move them away from process execution, the manual labor of reconciling spreadsheets, matching invoices, hunting down missing receipts, and elevate them into intelligence governance. They have to become the managers of machines. They have to set the parameters for the agents, review the highly complex exceptions that fall outside the algorithmic confidence intervals, and continuously monitor the performance of the network.
Yeah, I see that.
If your organization is culturally or structurally incapable of elevating its workforce to govern machine behavior, your entire network of agents will fail. It will collapse under its own weight, regardless of how continuous or pristine your data stream is. You will have built a beautifully running engine with absolutely no one trained to drive the car.
But how can a human reasonably govern an agent if the human doesn't inherently trust the data the agent is looking at? I hear your point about the human shift, but we keep coming back to the foundation. You cannot automate what you cannot mathematically define.
Right.
If I am summarizing the core of my position today, it is that the path to joining that successful 5% requires an absolutely uncompromising commitment to the data foundation. Until organizations are willing to abandon the semantic decay inherent in the overlay model, until they stop throwing gears into a bucket and instead invest heavily in a canonical data layer, their AI will continue to fail in production.
Okay.
The complexity of the real world, the messy factory floor, will break the model every single time. The mantra for the enterprise has to be, fix the architecture, and the AI will follow.
And to summarize my position, while I agree that a canonical foundation is necessary, you do need the gears to fit together. It is not the true differentiator. Perfect data without automated action is just a faster treadmill for human workers. The differentiator of success is the foresight to design an automated governance framework before you ever deploy the model to the factory floor. Shifting from chain of thought recommendations to chain of action execution, bounded by defined parameters and backed by immutable cryptographic audit trails, is the only thing that delivers structural financial impact. It is the only way to break through the human throughput ceiling and actually scale your operations.
Well, I think where we fundamentally converge today, despite our different angles of attack, is on one absolute premise. You cannot layer advanced intelligence on top of existing broken processes.
Completely agreed.
When you look closely at the investments made by this successful 5%,
Whether we categorize them as data quality initiatives or scalable compliance frameworks, they were actually initiated long before AI was even the target application. They were just trying to build a clean core.
Right. They weren't building an AI strategy, they were building a reality-based digital infrastructure. And when the AI finally arrived, it had a solid foundation to build on.
It really forces leaders to critically evaluate their own organizations.
Yeah.
Are they merely running isolated pilots on curated sandboxes, generating press releases and phantom metrics that look good to the board? Or are they doing the grueling, highly unglamorous work of building the canonical data reality and the automated governance parameters required to actually support an Internet of Agents?
Because if you are just hooking up a brilliant model to a broken extraction layer without the governance to control its actions, you are quite literally building a skyscraper on sand.
Which brings us right back to our factory floor. You can engineer the most sophisticated, intelligent robotic arm the world has ever seen. But if you don't control the conveyor belt feeding it the materials, and you don't have the safety protocols governing its autonomous movement, it is only a matter of time before the system shatters.
Exactly.
The question we leave you with today is this. In your own enterprise, which architectural pillar is the critical missing link? Is it the integrity of the parts on the belt or the governance of the machine doing the work?
I mean, it is a question worth answering before funding the next pilot.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.